Kia ora and welcome to today's daily course. I'm Bernard Hickey for the Kaka. Today I wanted to have a look at the differences between the Australian and New Zealand economies and why that's driving an exodus of workers to Australia. You might have heard about this. As much as 220 New Zealanders each day are leaving permanently, and net migration of New Zealand residents to Australia is near record highs. It surged in the last 6 months in particular. It's been a long-term drip, if you like, from the New Zealand economy to the Australian economy for at least the last 20 years, but it has accelerated in the last 6 months in particular. I wanted to talk about why that is the case and to try to understand what might happen next. To do that, I've got some charts which are in today's email newsletter if you're listening to this, but if you're watching the video, I'm just going to pop up the charts now. This is a chart showing the number of applications for jobs per ad on Seek in New Zealand in the last 20 years or so. And what you can see is that there has been an explosion in the number of applications per job ad in the last 18 months, and in particular in 2024, to the point now where the stress, if you like, in the labour market, the number of applications per job, how many people are looking for work, but also how many jobs are out there, that number has more than quadrupled in the last year. In fact, it's sextupled from its lows a couple of years ago. And it's gone much, much higher than at the worst point of COVID. Now you may wonder, well, surely everyone else is like this too. No. In Australia, where Seek obviously are based, that there has been an increase in stress, but the number of job applications per ad has only doubled this year, not quadrupled, and it's still just below the peak seen during COVID. So what else is going on here? Well, you can see in this chart that jobs are actually still growing in Australia. Last week we got some numbers that actually surprised people in how robust the Australian labour market has been in the last 3 or 4 months. It's actually been growing right through the period when ours has been very weak to falling. So when you look at the last 3 months in particular, there's been a dramatic difference in the relative performances of the Australian labour market. So why is that? Why is Australia performing so much better than New Zealand? Well, let's start with monetary policy. We know that the Australian Reserve Bank of Australia, decided to start tightening significantly later than ours. Ours started tightening in October of 2021, whereas the Reserve Bank of Australia didn't start until May of 2022. And when the Australians hiked, they only hiked by around about 425 basis points, whereas New Zealand increased by 525 basis points. Now, New Zealand has started cutting and the Australians have not, but it's clear that monetary policy was tighter in New Zealand for longer than in Australia. Now, you can make judgments about who's been too tight and who's been too loose, or whether one's been too tight and the other's been too loose. But definitely monetary policy is one of the reasons why the Australian economy is still growing faster than ours. The Reserve Bank there didn't hike as much as us or as early. The other reason is that our new government, certainly since January, February, has been tightening fiscal policy a lot more. This is a chart that came out of Treasury about a month ago, showing the extent of the fiscal tightening currently built into the government's financial forecasts. shows that we're going to see per capita real government consumption fall significantly and by more than at any other time in New Zealand's history. So that's a very, very tight trajectory for monetary policy. Whereas when you look at what's happening in Australia, the combined government spending, federal, state, territory and local, and remember state and local governments in Australia are bigger and do a lot more than our councils. And you can see the purple line there, that is the the amount of investment, public investment by governments in Australia. You can see it's risen from around about 3.5% of GDP to 5.5% of GDP in the last 10 years or so. And over the last 20 years, it has risen. It's almost doubled. Now, the size of government in spending per year, so there's not investment but spending, and that's the green line, has significantly increased as well, from around about 18% of GDP to closer to 22% of GDP. And actually that 4 percentage points increase is not that much smaller than what we've seen in New Zealand. And it's also interesting that most of that happened in Australia under a Liberal or Conservative national led government. As you can see here, that's how Australia has tightened earlier and more than us. Now, the other differences between the Australian and New Zealand economy that are also clear and a function of sort of longer term settings is that New Zealand has a much lower household savings rate than Australia, the US, and pretty much everyone. Now, we know why. New Zealand households have begun to understand that if they use whatever savings they have to leverage up and buy residential land, then they're in a much stronger position to make higher tax-free gains on their equity than any other investment choice. And of course, there are no incentives or tax breaks for saving in any other type of vehicle. So that's one of the reasons for New Zealand's lower savings rate, and that flows through into a lower investment rate. It also means ultimately that we invest less capital in our economies, and that means that productivity, the amount of output per hour worked, is considerably lower and has grown slower than in Australia. And that's led to that 30% gap between Australian wages and our wages. So what happens when you see the relative performances of the labour markets diverge? So this is one way to measure it. This is from Westpac and shows the red line is the New Zealand unemployment rate less the Australian unemployment rate. And what you can see is that for most of the last decade, New Zealand's unemployment rate has been below the Australian unemployment rate. However, in the last 12 months or so, that has swapped around so that Australia's unemployment rate is now lower than ours. And then the correlation, the black line, is the net flow of New Zealanders to Australia. And you can see there's a fairly close correlation. You don't know that that's causation, but you have to suggest that it's a reasonable thing to expect that if there are more jobs on offer in Australia than there are in New Zealand, there's stress in the New Zealand labour market, then you're likely to see people move across. That's one of the reasons why we've got this net outflow headed over 50,000. And unfortunately, it looks to be getting worse because Australia's labour market continues to perform well thanks to those looser fiscal policies, and you could argue looser monetary policies. And also, we've yet to see the full pain, if you like, from the fiscal policy tightening in New Zealand. That was today's Dawn Chorus, well, a bit later than a Dawn Chorus, and gives you an idea of what's happening today and in relation to the Australian economy. I'm Bernard Hickey for the kaka.